Yesterday morning, we had a great workshop on DAOs. We were able to dive a little bit deeper into the theoretical side of DAOs, but also discuss a little bit more the operational side. And today, we'll be synthesizing that in the great panel that is right below us, or before us in this case. So Marta, Velez, please bring your speakers to the stage. We'll be having Marta as a moderator, Marta from Common Ground. Then we have Dominika from WorkDAO, one of our top sponsors, together with Chain Analysis. Without them, this event will not be possible. And then we have António from the University of Lisbon, a professor and researcher, and José Nuno, which is a serial general counsel in various DAOs. So looking forward to see what you have to tell us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited about this conversation. So it's still pretty early in the DAO landscape. We see a lot of DAOs now trying to reduce governance responsibilities in order to reduce risks, increase further decentralization. In reality, there are a lot of different frameworks being explored. And yeah, today we have experts with us that will tell us a bit more about regulation around DAOs and so on. So maybe, António, I'll start with you. So you were moderating a workshop on DAO regulation yesterday. Today you're on the speaker slot. So tell us, is DAO regulation really desirable and necessary?
Well, that is a million-dollar question, of course, around DAO, around how to try to ascertain the status of DAOs. Because the thing is, well, some DAOs or some people outside of the DAOverse still have this perception that DAOs, for some reason, are under the legal radar. But as Nuno yesterday said in our panel, nothing escapes the law. The law finds a way to get to you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just we could philosophize about that for hours. That's just a fact of human nature and human society. And the thing is, most DAOs, as we stand today, would be considered, of course, when I talk about DAOs, I talk about a more restricted concept of DAOs, not the super wide concept that would include like almost every blockchain on it. I'm talking about more DAOs conceptualized as organizations. Many of them would be considered, if put before a judge in any major jurisdiction, they would be considered either a general partnership in common law countries, or they would be considered what we call in the continental systems a civil society, so Société Civile in French, or Gesellschaft bürgerlichen Rechts in German. So basically, they are all the same. So basically, organizations with a contractual nature, with no legal personality, but with several and joint liability for all the members. And that's not necessarily what DAO members are looking after. So basically, well, an easy way, but it has to be like crafted in a very balanced way, would be to try to get some recognition or legal acknowledgement of DAOs. Some jurisdictions have been trying to do that, like Vermont and Wyoming in the US or the Marshall Islands, whereby they try at the same time to give legal personality and limited liability to DAOs, but at the same time they try to leave the governance issues for the DAOs to decide for themselves, because most laws, in order to create a company, would demand that in exchange for limited liability and legal personality for some kind of enforced governance model. So usually a separation between ownership and control, so usually the dichotomy between shareholders and management. And DAOs do not want that at all, because, well, that's far from decentralized, of course. So yeah, of course, legal recognition, if carefully crafted, could be a way to definitely bridge the gap between DAOs. And I don't like the expression real world in this case, because, well, DAOs, well, and everything that goes on the blockchain, it's still a relationship between humans. So that is real. It's the same thing as like if we were telling like 6 years ago that contracts made by telephone were not real because they were not people were not in person. No, they are real. So maybe off-chain or on-chain dichotomy would be more acceptable or more adequate. But yeah, so those relationships are still real and are legally valuable, whether you want it or not. I think that would be my take on it.
Thank you. So, José Nuno, you have a lot of experience working with different DAOs as a general counselor. So, in your experience, helping these DAOs navigate the regulation or the lack of it, what are the key challenges for?
Well, there are many challenges. while navigating the DAO space. One of them is precisely the lack of regulation. So, not that I'm totally in favor of having regulation, but I think it would help to have some sort of framework that would give a clear idea what would be the consequences, or what would be the roadmap in terms of compliance in order to fulfill all the legal requirements in this space. We don't have that. So our work within a DAO is trying to perceive what the risks are, is a risk assessment base, and trying to comply with the applicable laws as within the framework, the existing framework from, I know António doesn't want this expression, from the traditional world, but it is what we have. So that's how we have to comply with. So namely, the main challenges, I would say, securities law, money laundering, taxes, besides all the problems that relate to working with people, which is engaging with contractors, employees, paying social security. That type of real-world establishment rules that happen on-chain, on-chain entities need to have some sort of embodiment in real life, so to speak.
And do you see a big difference between different jurisdictions? I mean, everyone seems to agree that the US, it's quite a challenging, and a lot of DAOs and projects try to stay away from the US. And then we have a lot of projects being built from Singapore and so on. Do you see a lot of differences? And if you want to tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, there are major differences still. I think that throughout these years, the perception of those differences has increased. So people are, and regulators are more keen to accept some sort of basic requirements in this space. So I think those differences have been decreasing throughout the years. Although it is still the case that some DAOs are choosing some jurisdictions instead of others. That's why yesterday on our workshop we talked a bit about the harmonization on regulatory matters and how that would be in favor of some sort of clarity and also in order to try to achieve a sort of broader compliance in terms of entities that do not have like a border geolocalization, right? I think that would help, but it is still the case that some jurisdictions are more laid back in terms of enforcement, even enforcement of some of the regulations they have. I don't think that's good, to be clear. I think that actually leads to some sort of choosing the forum, choosing the legislative framework without any correspondence to the business itself, to the entity itself. So it would be the case that this discrepancy between where the operation is been running with some sort of connection with real life exists in one jurisdiction, and then you have the operation being run by many other jurisdictions elsewhere.
Thank you for that explanation. It was quite insightful. Maybe Dom, so you work with WorkDAO. You are one of the co-founders. So you have a more practical experience with these matters. You actually help gapping this bridge between the real world and DAOs, right? Like by helping DAOs employing contributors and token-only payrolls and so on. So maybe if you can tell us a bit more on how you're helping other like DAOs and these kind of projects, gapping this bridge, and how do you characterize the typical DAOs regulatory concerns? Like what do you see with all the DAOs you've been helping and collaborating with?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So let's start
with WorkDAO.
Let's start with WorkDAO. So we specifically focus on that contributor side of compliance. So there is obviously a big debate around whether to have a legal wrapper or not, and if so, in which jurisdiction and what legal wrapper to choose. We sort of abstract from that. We work with DAOs in every shape and form, also Web3 organizations, making sure that they can legally and compliantly onboard contributors, either as employees or independent contractors, in line with labor, employment, and compensation laws in every jurisdiction that contributors are actually based in and live in. Of course, the compensation piece is pretty complex in DAOs. The moment you start to pay people in tokens or stables, it's much more complex to run, payroll, and again, run it across jurisdictions. So we make sure that we build infrastructure tools and solutions that enable DAOs to actually contract and engage contributors, pay them across stables, tokens, and fiat, pay taxes legally and compliantly in specific jurisdictions where people are based, and a few other adjacent things that I'm sure that we will touch on later on in this panel. Going back to the points that you made, it's very interesting because DAOs are jurisdictionless, or they aim to be jurisdictionless tools or frameworks for organizing contributors, but contributors are hyper-jurisdictional. We all live in specific places. We need to maintain proper residency status. We want to travel, have visas, passports. We need to pay taxes. We might want to access healthcare and benefits and social security. And so we specifically at WorkDAO are focusing on that local jurisdiction and contributor problem. Of course, by doing so, we simplify a lot of operational burdens for DAOs. And then the second part of your question around typical DAO regulatory concerns, there isn't still a typical DAO. I think that this is still very much an experiment, and we are seeing a lot of different approaches to way DAOs are structured, the way DAOs operate, the way DAOs approach their governance as well. And so still, we are still to see that typical DAO and typical concerns, but definitely regulation, and especially regulation and enforcement that we have been seeing recently that comes after the end contributor, so the end point, which is the contributor. That's really top of mind now. There's a lot of people in the space, and in order to get even more people contribute to DAOs, we need to make it a bit simpler and safer for contributors to contribute.
So yeah, maybe touching on that point, I'll make you a question maybe to António or about what a lot of people are talking about these days, what happened with WorkDAO. So maybe if you want to explain us a bit more what happened, and do you think it would be possible that something like that could happen in Europe? Is this more like a US because of the way they work? If you want to explain us a bit more about that.
So basically what happened with Uki is that some people got sued just by working or being related to a DAO. No, I don't know the specifics of that, but it just brought up the liability issue of members of a DAO or acting within the DAO from operations that were deployed or not deployed in the case and should have been done by acting as a DAO. I think we are all very keen to just watch what all of this is how this is going to play out. I know that some players have jumped into that case also to defend that the way the CFTC has made the complaint, the case is not has not judicial value in the US. I think in the US we will have some results first. And it will take a while in the EU or the jurisdictions to have some jurisprudence on this. I also know that some players are trying to force to have some jurisprudence also in the US, like naming, probably they suing some of the DAOs just expecting to have which is kind of interesting. So trying to have some clarity on use cases within DAOs in the US. I'm also very interested in seeing how this will play out. But in Europe and Switzerland and we have a totally different scenario. So there is not this case of litigation as a business plan. So I think it will take some time until there's some content on the cases that will come up to light with like basically for people to understand what happened. So it's like people acting within the DAO, which we call in LabDAO. So there was not like a legal framework under which they were acting. Were sued individually and directly by others, I don't know who, trying to have some sort of enforcement by acting within the DAO. And just to framing this, it's just because by acting as a DAO, one of the problems is that you are personal and individually liable for not only for your actions, but the actions within that general partnership. So, and this is a huge problem for this space because people are getting together under this type of tooling and organization in order to achieve something. And that means that the enforceability with that will come directly into their scope.
If I might add something as well, because of I think that the liability issue, the evil contractual or non-contractual civil liability with DAOs is probably one of the toughest nuts to crack here, because the thing is, because if we had the scenario in which DAOs would have some kind of, okay, it doesn't have to be legal personality, but where the law could at least isolate some of their assets, like the common assets that are pulled together to pursue whatever activity, profit or non-profit that the DAO pursues, that would actually make life easier for many token holders or members, because the thing is, not only because, well, otherwise it would be directly liable, but also because there would be a specific pool of assets which would correspond to their contributions, which others could sue them for. So it would be much easier. Just pick up those assets like we do with companies. I don't want to force too much the comparison between DAOs and companies, but in that sense, limited liability does have that advantage. But usually limited liability comes at a certain cost. So usually either registration or either some subjection to at least a minimum set of rules. And also another issue, but that applies to everything related to the blockchain universe, is that in the end of the day, the states have not found, neither states or their judicial systems have found ways to seize crypto assets. So basically, if a certain DAO, as its assets, only has crypto assets, it's not the same thing as like freezing a bank account in order for private creditors to judicially have it seized and then using that money to get paid, as it usually happens on real life. And unless there is a material solution to that, which at the moment I don't think there is, most of the liability issues would be difficult to solve, and especially if there's not an identifiable pool of assets that can be used through judicial means.
Yeah, to add to this, actually, it's also fairly difficult, and in WorkDAO case, this was proven true, that it's also not easy to find identifiable people. So it's you might have a founding team, you might then have a core team, but ultimately then you have sort of broader pool of people that in one way or the other are part of the DAO, but their actual contribution or their roles or their involvement is less obvious. And the reason why WorkDAO case is, sends shockwaves is that the legal notice was served by a chat box on the website. So it's almost as if someone showed up here and shouted, "You are all responsible for this conference," all of a sudden, and everything that went wrong with it. So that is still a challenge, and we are still seeing, both the regulators trying to find ways of actually enforcing and learning about actually how to enforce and who to enforce.
So what kind of legal engineering and community advice would you give to the DAOs you are working with, in terms of how should they structure themselves, how should they position themselves, how should they, I guess a lot of people that collaborate with DAOs are now with an increasing fear of being prosecuted or being chased. So what kind of advice do you usually give to the DAOs you're working with?
Mm-hmm. I think that the fact that you are contributing to a DAO or DAO itself it does not solve any issue. It's like the fact that it's a DAO doesn't mean that you can escape regulatory regimes. It doesn't mean that you as a DAO contributor don't have responsibilities that are in some ways, similar to responsibilities of being a citizen in a specific country or a contributor to a typical project or company. And then on an operational side, the fact that it's a DAO doesn't mean that you can avoid compliance in every shape of compliance. You still have to, at least from our perspective, things that we care about is you still need to comply with employment laws and labor laws across all jurisdictions. You still have to understand payroll rules. If there is minimum wage requirements in many countries, you need to satisfy them in fiat, at least the minimum wage portion. You need to know that. In other countries, UK, for example, you can pay in tokens, but if there's a severe price volatility and all of a sudden the token compensation drops below minimum wage, you as a DAO you're liable for not meeting those requirements. And the biggest portion probably is tax withholding. As an employer, you have statutory requirement to do tax withholding on the compensation to the employee. If you have most DAOs are very, very distributed. People already contribute from anywhere. To understand all of those rules, it takes immense operational burden and a lot of maturity that you would have to have on the team. So WorkDAO is a solution to some of those problems. It's not a solution to all, but I think that we are seeing a lot of projects coming and helping DAOs think through those issues. And I think that's really important to just keep in mind that just think through what you are doing and the sort of 5 steps ahead to make sure that you will not regret or you will not find yourself in a tricky position when regulators decide to go after DAO or you. And it's not, there's no straightforward answer to how to protect yourself. There's no, one way. But just being mindful that the fact that you are contributing to a DAO doesn't mean that you are above regulatory systems globally. Yeah.
Actually, on the fact that you said that there are more projects also helping DAOs, so I think that's a good development on the landscape becoming more mature and so on. Do you have any projects you could highlight or examples you could give us of other projects helping DAOs on all this regulatory landscape and becoming more structured and so on?
Yeah, I think that there is. It's difficult to assess DAO tooling landscape because there's just a lot of projects that come and go. Also, compliance is still an emerging issue within DAO tooling. So, one of the major areas that are that the DAO tooling is focused on is payments. But something that we at WorkDAO are really, really focused on is you need to think about the payment rails that you are using because lots of them don't have any link to local compliance. So the fact that there are some ways of making payments easier doesn't mean that the tax withholding in a specific jurisdiction is taken care of. Or in some jurisdiction, there are some money transmitter laws that you have to comply with, and not all of those projects do so. So actually, I don't want to promote projects. I want to actually just advocate for people really being careful about solutions that they use, because the fact that the idea that you can outsource all of your problems as a DAO or as a DAO contributor, it's not going to work. So I would just, encourage everyone to really think for themselves and really assess the tools from a macro perspective.
Yeah. Actually, one thing, so since I got moderating this panel and I don't know much about the legal framework, I actually did some research to try to understand a bit more about this regulatory space, specific on DAOs, and I have to say it's quite spread out. It's not really easy to get the information not being a legal person. Do you guys have any suggestions on how people can better educate themselves about all of this? Because I collaborate with a number of DAOs, but I never really thought about all these legal issues that might arise by just the fact that I'm voting on proposals and so on. Do you have any suggestions on how people can better educate themselves?
Well, I think that talk to your lawyer is one, right? And then the lawyer will try to do that risk assessment analysis on first, and try to see what laws would be applicable on a first layer, and then try to have a broader perspective of what would be the legal implications of the operation as a whole, which could include, for instance, trying to see where the majority of the team is located, if they need to hire some sort of services to pay the team, for instance, or if they want to issue some kind of assets, what type of assets are they issuing, from where should they have an analysis or on certain jurisdiction trying to comply with the existing laws. António mentioned this, and we also highlighted this yesterday on the workshop. It's not there is a legal vacuum on DAOs. The law finds its way in, and there are solutions to resolve many of the problems that the laws have. We just don't have a unified framework that could be applicable to DAOs. So that doesn't mean that DAOs are above the law or can be away from any type of responsibility. I think the main idea that I would like to highlight, and it's probably where we are at this space right now, is about accountability. And people that interact within DAOs, they have to understand they can and should be held accountable for their actions within the DAO. So when we talk about legal wrappers and as a whole, and having a wrapper that will some sort of limit the liability of all participants, I think each contributor should also think on themselves how they can interact with this DAO in a responsible way, if they have to incorporate any type of entity in order to interact with that DAO so that themselves have their own type of limitation of liability, the better. There is no unique solution for this, and each DAO is different. Each case is different, and I think that it's what gives the beauty of this. So you can customize the DAO to the purpose that as you see fit, and you go from there. So it grows and expands as a normal community.
Okay. So we still have a few more minutes. I don't know if you want to share some final remarks.
Maybe I'll just give like an overarching remark, which applies especially to DAOs as we're discussing what could be the framework, an initial, of course, and very embryonic framework of their regulation. But I think there's something we should always keep in mind that it applies to DAOs. It applies to almost every phenomenon that has come out of the blockchain revolution, which is when crafting regulation, there's always a very fine balance that legislators have to reach between legitimation and between alienation. So basically, the thing is, when for instance, when a phenomenon like DAOs is not explicitly regulated in the DAO, the majority of the public will say, I don't care, I'm not going to get into that because it's too risky, I have no idea what's going on, so people will get out of it. But when you legitimize, and I use legitimize even in the etymological sense of the word, like you make something law from legitimize, you actually draw in more people, so you can scale up. It potentially could scale up operations, of course, but you have to make sure that you do not overbear, of course, the regulation or kill the baby at its infancy. But you will always alienate some of the more, I wouldn't use hardcore because that might sound a bit condescending, but the more committed parts of the community, because many of these innovations were built with a strong ideological bedrock of trying to do things not exactly under the law or under the state, but parallel to it. But as José Nunes said, it's impossible to escape the law. The law will always get you, not in the bad sense, but it also has some benefits, but the law will always get you. So this balance has to be very finely reached. That's I would say that would be my final remark on that.
Thank you. I don't know, Dom, do you want to say some last words about the topic?
Yeah, to that point, actually, there's this sort of fun fact of the week, I guess, that Japanese government is starting their own DAO as a way of, learning about what a DAO is. So we are definitely seeing a lot of, still a lot of experimentation, and especially experimentation in ways of governments and engaging. And it's positive. That's also, why we are all here. I think that this is an amazing space, and the fact that there's a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives is an amazing opportunity. So when we will be there having cocktails, please come say hello, but also talk to each other, because you never know who's here sitting next to you, and what an amazing collaboration can come out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I just want to thank you. This was a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, more than on the podcast and the articles I've been trying to read. So yeah, thank you all for participating and sharing your views and experience on this topic. And how do we close this?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.